me now is Michael Bociurkiw. He's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council who previously worked with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. He's a Canadian, Ukrainian heritage, and today we've reached him in Odesa. Hi, Michael.
Hi, Susan. Good to be with you.
You've just heard from Mykola Kuleba about efforts to return Ukrainian children. Clearly, this is a priority for the Zelensky government. Why do you think it's proving so challenging?
Well, it's proving so challenging, Susan, because I think the West, many Western leaders are falling for Mr. Putin's bluff. But I think the only way to put an end to these war crimes, to these forced deportations, to what Ukrainian children are facing in the occupied territories and in Russia, is to really push back hard against Mr. Putin. You may have heard that the West has finally got its act together to get a $50 billion loan to Ukraine based on frozen Russian assets. Well, at the snap of his fingers, Mr. Putin can come up with a lot more than that. Those types of figures need to be doubled, tripled, quadrupled in order to really show him that the West is serious, that they're going to give Ukraine everything they need to fight back. But that just isn't happening right now. And meanwhile, this children's catastrophe, which I call it, is continuing with at least 2 children killed every day, thousands injured, and deprivation of education, separation from families. The list is very long.
Michael, you're in Odesa today. You've been there a lot in the last 2 years. I understand there's some activity there this morning. What's going on?
Yeah, well, if you had connected about 45 minutes ago, I would have been talking to you from a bomb shelter. We had 2 ballistic missiles come to Odesa. I believe there's 1 death reported already. And, Susan, these are pretty scary in the sense that the air raid siren goes off. But when these are high-speed missiles like the ones that arrived today, no one has time to reach the bomb shelter. So it's a mix right now of drones and rockets targeting Odesa, as well as many other Ukrainian cities. But I have to remind everyone, I'm, just less than a kilometer from the port here. There's a whole lineup of ships here waiting to come in, pick up grain, and take it to world markets, to countries in Africa. And if this is ramped up, it's going to be a lot tougher. This key artery could be cut off once again.
Michael, you and I have talked about Ukraine many, many times over the last 10 years, really.
Yeah.
How are Ukrainians feeling as we head into yet another winter in this war?
Not very good. I think the mood is quite bleak for a number of reasons. One is, domestically, with winter coming and with up to 80% of thermal power plants damaged or destroyed, we're not quite sure how Ukraine is going to cope with providing continuous power and heating to people. In fact, a recent survey says that if the situation doesn't get better, you could have up to 8 million people leave Ukraine for Europe. It's almost impossible to wrap one's head around that, given the numbers are so big. But that's what people fear right now, is that they're not going to be able to make it through the winter. And I suspect that the Russians will ramp up their targeting of power plants further.
Well, in fact, we heard of another potential escalation for sure. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte confirmed yesterday that North Korean troops are deployed to the Kursk region of Russia, where Ukrainian soldiers have a foothold. Let's listen.
The deepening military cooperation between Russia and North Korea is a threat to both the Indo-Pacific and Euro-Atlantic security. It undermines peace on the Korean peninsula and fuels the Russian war against Ukraine.
Rutte is describing this as a dangerous expansion of Russia's war. What do you think, Michael?
Well, what I think is words just don't stop Russian missiles the way Patriot air defense systems do. So a lot of talk from the NATO SG and others, but they have to back it up with actions. And that's the feeling here on the ground in Ukraine. And the number one ask right now, which is not being fulfilled, is to give the Ukrainians the ability to strike key targets in Russia, the exact sites, launch pads where these Russian missiles that we received today are coming from. But again, I think there's just a weakness among Western leaders to confront Mr. Putin. And, you're seeing what's happening with those North Korean troops. This war is being globalized, involving North Korea, having involved Iran, and on the periphery, China. And again, we're not just getting the actions needed. And by the way, also, of course, more air defense systems are needed, because what's happening in Odesa right now, key international arteries should be far, far better protected.
Well, and of course, we're all a week away from the U.S. election. It's extremely tight. Support for Ukraine is one of the divisive international issues. Let's listen to Republican vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance from a town hall on the cable channel News Nation on Ukraine last week.
When you talk to, Ukrainian leaders, especially in private, but even in public, they're starting to say this now. They're saying this can't go on forever. They don't have the manpower. They don't have the equipment. They don't have the money. And so I think ultimately, again, Ukraine is going to have to make that decision. Russia is going to have to, of course, make the decision about what it will do to stop the fighting. But we're going to have to get these guys together. We don't have to like Russia. We don't have to agree with them invading, but we've got to get them together and engage in some real diplomacy, or this thing's going to go on forever.
Michael, what should we be reading into that comment from J.D. Vance?
Well, these are pretty similar to Kremlin key talking points. What wasn't in that clip is what J.D. Vance proposed to end the war in Ukraine. And that includes allowing Russia to keep the territories it has already seized, and possibly even 2 more oblasts, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. It calls for some vague demilitarized zone policed by peacekeepers. And very crucially, which has not gone over well here in Ukraine, is asking Ukraine to drop its NATO bid. So the fear here is that if Mr. Trump does get in, he will either before Inauguration Day or immediately try to come to a deal with Mr. Putin that will not be in Ukraine's favor. So this explains why the mood here is so grim right now. Let's see what happens. But even, with due respect to President Biden and his vice president, they have still not shown the resolve that I talked about earlier that's needed to push Mr. Putin back.
And given what you just said, can you and others envision a scenario where the U.S. would withdraw military support?
Sadly, yes. And I think part of that has to do with the mood in the United States right now, where a lot of folks are more concerned with their economic well-being, with immigration, and they don't see the United States being the world policeman anymore. That's why I've said for a long time that more of the responsibility for the war in Ukraine is going to fall on the shoulders of the Europeans. And again, that is why, despite the fact that it's only $50 billion, it's a good sign that they finally have grown the spine to use the interest from those seized Russian assets in Europe to help Ukraine push back Mr. Putin. There was a lot of worry about that earlier, but they finally came around and done it. But as you know, here in Europe as well, changes of governments that are becoming more right-leaning. Look what happened in Georgia the past couple of days, and what could happen in Moldova this weekend.
And just staying with the U.S. election for a moment more, there are reports that Elon Musk has had conversations with Vladimir Putin over the last 2 years, something the Kremlin denies. What do you make of that?
Nothing less than a bombshell. Let's remind everyone of who Mr. Musk is. He's one of the most influential players in this election. He's a billionaire. He owns SpaceX, which is sending U.S. satellites, including spy satellites, into space. And he has security clearance. And if the Wall Street Journal reporting is to be believed, Mr. Putin also asked Mr. Musk to avoid activating his Starlink internet service over Taiwan as a favor to Xi Jinping. So there you go. That says it all, I think. It's an unbelievable kind of development of how some of these tech bros have become such big players in this election and seem to look up to strong men like Mr. Putin. Unbelievable.
Michael, lastly, in the minute and a half we have left, we're 4 months now away from the 3-year anniversary, the 3-year mark of this war. Is Russia gaining ground? More bluntly, is Vladimir Putin winning?
Well, it doesn't look very good. And the big reason for that is they are making gains on the ground, on the front line. In fact, they're nearing on the city of Pokrovsk. And what is right there is a big coal plant, which helps Ukraine produce a lot of its steel output, its second biggest export. And if they get that, it said it may halve have Ukraine's steel production, which would be a big blow to the economy. The other thing that's happening, as we already talked about, the North Koreans getting more involved, Iran, and also China on the sidelines. So it's happening on many, many fronts where the Russians are gaining ground. They're also said to be shrinking that area in Kursk that Ukraine seized earlier this summer. He has a work economy at the snap of his fingers. He can order mobilization. He can also order a lot more money to be devoted. But there is, the one glimmer of hope for Ukrainians, I guess, is quite a resistance among ordinary Russians to come and fight to Ukraine. That's why, out of a sign of desperation, he had to go to North Korea. Let's see what kind of impact that has.
It sounds dire. Again, Michael, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Stay safe. Michael Bociurkiw is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and we reached him today in Odesa. I'm Susan Ormiston.